All right, let's talk for a few minutes about Photoshop brushes. I'd like you to begin by selecting the brush tool. It looks like it's about the sixth tool down in your tool panel. And let's change our workspace to painting. And when we change, that will rearrange your panels over here and give you access to the brushes panel. I'd like you to click on this button, and that opens up your brushes settings. So let's keep both of these open while we're playing around with the brushes. If you're in some other workspace, these tools are available, these panels are available right here. So let's take a look at these two panels for a moment. The brushes panel is essentially a collection of brush presets. So a brush preset is basically a brush tip. Now if I come over here to my brush settings and click here on brush tip shapes, this shows you all the various brush tips that are currently loaded. And basically, when you select a brush preset, what a preset is it's a tip to which different properties have been applied and then it's been saved. So we are going to look at what these various properties are and how you can create your own custom brushes or modify existing presets. Let's just start with a simple round brush. In the brush tip shape, you can change the size, and you could change it from a perfect circle to an ellipse, which we will do here in a moment. Hardness is important. If you crank this all the way up, it's going to have a very hard edge. Bring it all the way down, and you're going to have a very kind of fuzzy, soft edge. Now the reason my preview here is showing you thin, thick, thin is because in Shape Dynamics, the pen pressure has been selected under Control, under Size. So Size, Control, Pen Pressure. If I turn that off, you're going to see in the preview here that we just have a consistent stroke, no thick and thin. In order to access the pen pressure, you do have to work with a graphics tablet and a grip pen. I'm currently working with the Wacom Intuos Pro tablet, but there are other tablets available as well. You cannot use the Shape Dynamics, or at least you can't use the pressure sensitive feature within Shape Dynamics without having a graphics tablet hooked up. In a lot of these properties, you're going to see something called jitter. Here we've got size jitter, we've got angle jitter. Basically, jitter is another word for randomness. So if I crank this up, you're going to see that now my stroke looks all bumpy. The reason for that is, let me go back a second to the brush tip shape. Down here at the bottom we've got spacing. Right now this appears to be a smooth stroke. If I open this up, you're going to see that it's not really a smooth stroke. It's individual dabs of paint, if you will, digital paint, that are just placed very close together. And that gives the illusion of it being a nice smooth stroke. So when you add a size jitter, it randomly changes the sizes of those individual dabs of paint and creates this kind of lumpy effect. With a brush that's perfectly round, a circle, you will not see any angle jitter because no matter what you do with the angle, it's going to still be a perfect circle. If, however, I go back into my tip and I change the shape to more of an oval rather than a circle, then I go in here, I can crank up roundness jitter, and again it's going to become all lumpy because that means the angle of the brush tip is randomly being changed, and so it's going to create this sort of lumpy effect. I'll leave it as an ellipse for the moment and come over here and start drawing in my composition window. But first I'm going to create a new layer, and this will just be my brushes explore layer. And once this gets very messy, I'll just select all and delete it and then start over. You can increase the size of your brush tip a couple of ways. I could come back into brush tip here and increase it over here. But you can also do it with a key command, and that is the square brackets. So right bracket will make the brush tip larger, left bracket will make it smaller. Under Shape Dynamics, angle jitter, I have the option to use pen tilt to control the angle. So now as I rotate my pen, you can see the angle of the brush tip changes. Now I'm going to paint very lightly first, very little pressure, and then more pressure. And then light pressure and more pressure. I'll change the angle. It doesn't work well to change the angle of your pen on the fly. It just looks really weird. So what you need to do actually is do a stroke, and then you lift the pen and change the angle, and it will look better. I'll go back to a round circle here for a minute and explore features with this. Very light, heavy, light. Let's look at some of the other properties we can work with here. Let's look at transfer. In transfer, we can change the opacity. So we can change the opacity with pressure, which is what I've got. So I'm going to select all and delete, deselect. Now if I press very light, now that I have transfer on, it'll be very pale and then it gets dark. If I increase the opacity jitter, then you see we're going to be able to see the individual dabs of paint, which I don't really like. So I'm going to come back, leave that off, and increase my size a little bit. Gray, pressing harder, goes darker, black, lighter, and like so. Okay, now let's take a moment and look at these items up here in the Options panel. These first two icons, as we mentioned, will give you access to these two panels, the brushes and the brush settings panels. This mode is the blend mode for the tool, so be careful with this one. This is different than the blend mode for the layer. And when you become more advanced, you may want to play around with this, but you have to remember to always change it back to normal. I think you encountered this in the gradients tutorial. We were playing around in the gradients by changing the blend mode of the background of the gradient tool. But if you don't change it back to normal, and then you try to use that tool later, it's not going to work the way you expect it to, and it's going to be very frustrating. So if you do use that, make sure you change it back to normal. Opacity, let's talk for a minute about that. I've got this set at 40%. Now on 40%, either with the mouse or with the stylus is another term for a grip pen. So either with the pen or the mouse, as long as you don't release the mouse or lift the pen, this will never get darker than 40%. If you release and then draw it again, where it overlaps the previous strokes, it will get darker, but the new strokes will not get darker than 40%. Okay, so then this button automatically makes your pen use pressure sensitivity for opacity. So that's just a quick way to activate or deactivate that feature. Now flow seems at first to be like opacity, but they are different. Let me select all and delete. Okay, with opacity up to 100%, I'm going to change the flow to 40%. And when I start painting with the flow, it will automatically build up. So flow is, that's the amount of paint that is coming out. So if you were using a real airbrush, holding down on the nozzle, more paint would come out and it will build up. So this is different from opacity. Now this airbrush, let's take a look at this for a minute. Without the airbrush feature on, if you click once with the mouse or with your stylus, it's not going to get any darker. Even if I keep holding down, say on the mouse or the pen, it's not going to get any darker. It's like if you spray can, just spray once, and that's it. With this on, and they call this Enable Airbrush Style Build-Up Effects. Okay, I'm just going to call it airbrush mode to make it simple. But with this one, if you hold it down, more and more paint will come out. And this is just like holding the nozzle of a spray can. You hold it down and it just increases the amount of paint that you get. I happen to like the airbrush feature a lot, so I use it frequently, particularly when masking, and I'll demonstrate that later on. Angle, you could change the angle of the brush here if you wish. This button automatically uses pressure sensitivity for size. This button is really a lot of fun. It actually creates kind of an echo effect around a particular, in this case, the vertical line. You see this? So it's kind of like a reflection. Now you can change this around just by clicking and rotating. I'm going to switch back to my brush and then get something like that. Let me select all and delete, do it again. So not only is this fun, it's very practical if you have to create something that is symmetrical, because creating something that is perfectly symmetrical is not easy. So this makes your life a lot easier. Say if we were doing a heart, for example. Hearts need to be perfectly symmetrical. This makes it real easy. Another little trick that can make your life a lot easier, particularly when masking, is something I call click, shift, click. Now I've switched to my mouse for a moment here, and I'm going to click, then hold the shift key down. I've released the mouse. I move over here, click. Now I'm released the mouse again, but I'm still holding the shift key. Click, click, click. So it's a great way to just create a straight line, a straight path. And this, particularly like I said, when masking, can be a big help. Now, in order to explore some of these other properties, I think it's fun to go into our legacy brushes and into the default brushes. If you get down near the bottom, there is something called scattered maple leaves. Let's choose that brush. And then we'll go into shape tip. Let's open up the spacing. So that's between the individual dabs of paint. In this case, each individual dab is a leaf. And let's look at some of the properties they've got going here. They have a size jitter, cranked all the way up. They also have angle jitter, cranked all the way up. A roundness jitter with a minimum roundness selected. What is scatter? Let's talk about scatter. We saw in brush tip spacing. So spacing moves the individual dabs of paint away from one another and gives you more space between each one. Scatter takes the individual dabs of paint and moves them away from the stroke. So you see it's kind of in 3D. I'm on both axes. So if you crank that way open, then you can establish the count. Do you want a lot or a few? This gets really fun. What I'd like you to do, first of all, is choose some colors for your foreground and background color. So let me move this out of the way for a moment, and I'll choose one of these orange, and then hold the option key and choose a green. So the option key allows me to pick the background color. So I have a foreground and a background color, kind of autumn colors. Now what I'm going to do is under color dynamics, I am going to use foreground background jitter. So I'll crank that all the way up. Also, I'm going to increase the size of my brush by using my right square bracket. And as I come here and click, this is what we get. Now we can also do a hue jitter. If I do a hue jitter, right now with the foreground background, it's just going between this orange and this green and shades in between. The hue jitter will go all the way around the color wheel, so you get much more colorful results. Saturation jitter, we'll just make it more saturated or less saturated. So these get a little bit confusing, which is which, saturation, brightness, and purity. I suggest you just play around with them and see what the result is, and you'll start getting a feel for what they will do. Under transfer, right now, let's just say we change the opacity. I'm going to select all and delete, and then try it again. Crank that up all the way. That's more noticeable. I could put the control on pen pressure. So if I press hard, it's more opaque, light, more transparent. Let's create a custom brush tip using the type tool. So our type tool is down here, the T, so just click on the T. And when the type tool is active, you see this is the option bar up here. This changes to your font and the style, size, and so forth. So I'm going to go with the Avenir. If I click, gives us a placeholder text, and I'll type in my name. I'm going to select this and make it larger. I can make it larger right here. Or I can do Command, Shift, and then the greater than bracket. So that's the right angle bracket. And maybe I'll make it bold. So I'll come in here, actually heavy, I'll make it heavy. And then you click the check mark here to deselect it. Now what I want to do is turn the letters themselves into a selection so I can define this as a brush tip. So I'm going to command click on the T in my layers panel. Okay, so now each letter is selected. I'm going to go define brush preset. I'll name it Daniel. Say OK. And then Daniel will appear at the bottom of my brush presets. And we can hide or delete the type layer. Now with Daniel selected, I'm going to go in here to brush tip, open up the spacing, basically do the same thing that was done to the leaf, except this time you're going to do it yourself. So I'll increase the size jitter, angle jitter, maybe the roundness. Scatter. I'm going to scatter them out. Increase the count. Go to color dynamics. I'm going to choose some different colors for the foreground and the background. And so I've got the foreground background jitter cranked up, the hue jitter, saturations. These are all the same, the settings that I had on the leaf. And now I'm going to come over here and see what the results are. So it's a lot of fun. I don't see much change in transfer. No, I don't have transfer on, so I'm going to turn the transfer on and do opacity jitter. And that makes it a little bit more interesting. Size, I'm not getting much difference in size. So I'm going to add pen pressure for size. Let me select all and delete, deselect. Yeah, so that makes a much more interesting result. You can actually make a brush tip out of pretty much anything, any layer. So you could scan a real leaf or any kind of an object and then make a selection of it, define it as a brush, create a brush preset, and it'll behave in the same way as this custom brush we just created with the type layer. Obviously, there are many more things to explore in the brushes panel. This is a very powerful tool. My suggestion is you just get in and start playing around, opening up some of these specialty brushes and looking at how they have been created, making changes yourself and seeing what the results are. There are also many tutorials online that show you how you can use these brushes in very, very interesting ways. Particularly those of you who are in illustration, you're going to want to explore these options and become very comfortable using this tool.